Don't sign that. Your daughter will lose everything. The words didn't echo, they landed, heavy and exact, like something that had already happened. For a split second, no one moved. The air in the glass-walled boardroom seemed to tighten, pulled thin between polished marble floors and the long, glowing conference table where million-dollar decisions were made in silence. Richard Whitmore's pen hovered just above the signature line, a fraction of an inch from sealing a deal that had taken 6 months, 12 negotiations, and the full weight of his company's future. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned his head. The voice hadn't come from the legal team. Not from the investors lining the walls in tailored suits. It came from the far side of the room, near the service door. A girl stood there, barely past the threshold, one hand still resting on the metal handle as if she hadn't meant to step in at all. Her uniform was simple, dark slacks, a gray maintenance shirt, a plastic badge clipped near her collar that caught the overhead light. Maya Carter. 16. Too young to be in a room like this, too still to be dismissed as a mistake. A janitor's cart sat just behind her, a half-used spray bottle swaying gently as if it had followed her in and stopped, confused. No one spoke. A few executives shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances that asked the same question without saying it: who let her in? Richard's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, a subtle tightening across his shoulders, the kind that came when control slipped just enough to be noticed. "Excuse me?" one of the partners said, his voice low, careful, as if raising it might validate her presence. Maya didn't flinch. Her eyes weren't wide or uncertain. They were steady, fixed on the document in front of Richard like she'd seen it before, like she knew exactly where to look. She took one step forward. The sound of her shoe against the marble was soft, but in the silence, it carried. "Clause 17, she said, her voice calm, almost quiet, but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "The adjustment provision, it doesn't protect your company. It redirects the medical fund into a discretionary pool." A pause. A longer one this time. Someone let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, quickly swallowed. "That's not possible," another voice muttered, more to the table than to her. Richard's pen lowered an inch, not touching the paper, just lowering. The overhead lights reflected faintly along the polished barrel, a thin line of white that trembled for a moment before going still. "And what exactly?" he said at last, his tone measured, controlled. "Would you know about a contract like this?" It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight of the room shifted with it, settling back into place, reminding everyone who held authority here. Maya's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, a small movement, almost invisible, but enough to catch the light as it brushed across her knuckles. She didn't look away. "I know what happens after you sign it," she said. Not louder. Not sharper. Just certain. And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like something waiting. The room did not release its tension, it only shifted, like something invisible had been placed at the center of the table, and no one wanted to touch it first. Maya Carter stood where she was, just inside the doorway, the faint scent of cleaning solution still clinging to her sleeves, her badge catching the light every time she breathed. She was not supposed to be here. That much was obvious in the way the assistants avoided looking directly at her, in the way one of the junior analysts subtly leaned back in his chair as if distance alone could restore order. But Maya had never been where she was supposed to be, not really. 8 hours earlier, she had been in the lower floors of the building, pushing the same cart, following the same quiet routine she and her mother had followed for years. Clean the glass, empty the bins, leave no trace. That was the job. Invisible work, done by invisible people. But Maya had always seen things others did not. Not because she was invited to, but because she paid attention. Because while others scrolled through their phones or rushed past documents left open on printers, she stopped. Read. She remembered. Back in their small apartment 20 minutes away, where the air conditioner rattled louder than it cooled and the kitchen table doubled as a study desk, Maya spent her nights with borrowed books and outdated business magazines her mother brought home from discarded office piles. She learned terms no one taught her: liability, asset transfer, risk exposure. Words that sounded distant and abstract until they were not. Until they meant something real. Her father used to say contracts were just stories written in smaller print, stories that could take everything from you if you did not read them carefully. He had learned that the hard way. Years ago, before he was gone, before the hospital bills stacked higher than the rent, before everything in their life narrowed into survival. Maya never forgot that. She could not afford to. That was why the folder on the copier tray had caught her eye earlier that morning. Thick paper, stamped final draft, left just slightly open like it had been handled in a hurry. She had not meant to read it. Not at first. But one glance turned into two, and two into a careful scan line by line, her fingers hovering just above the page as if touching it might set off an alarm. Most of it was standard language, dense and repetitive, but then she saw it. Clause 17. A single paragraph buried under layers of formal phrasing, structured just enough to sound protective, but twisted in a way that shifted responsibility without saying it outright. It did not eliminate risk. It moved it. Quietly. Completely. And not just into the company. Into the one fund that was supposed to be protected at all costs. The medical reserve. The one tied to long-term coverage, to dependents, to families who trusted it would be there when everything else failed. Maya had read it 3 times to be sure. Her chest tightening a little more each time. Because she knew what that meant. Not in theory. In real life. Back in the boardroom, the silence stretched again, thinner now, more fragile. Richard Whitmore's eyes had not left her, but there was something different in them now. Not belief. Not yet. But not dismissal either. His fingers tapped. Once against the edge of the document, a quiet, controlled motion that seemed louder than it should have been. Around him, the room waited, suspended between authority and uncertainty, between what they assumed to be true and what this girl, standing beside a janitor's cart, had just placed in front of them. Richard Whitmore did not raise his voice, and that was what made the shift more noticeable, because in a room like this power rarely needed volume to be felt. He leaned back slightly in his chair, just enough to create distance between himself and the document, as if the paper in front of him had changed weight without anyone touching it. Around him, the boardroom adjusted in quiet, practiced ways. A senior partner cleared his throat, not to speak, but to signal discomfort. Another executive tapped his tablet twice, pretending to review something that no longer held his attention. The illusion of control was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched across too many unanswered questions. "You are saying," Richard began slowly, each word measured, deliberate, "that a clause reviewed by 3 legal teams, negotiated across multiple firms, and approved at this table, is wrong." He did not look at the lawyers when he said it. He kept his eyes on Maya. That was the pressure. Not loud, not aggressive, but precise. Maya felt it, the way the air seemed to lean toward her, the way every person in the room expected her to hesitate, to backtrack, to realize where she stood and step back into silence. Her fingers brushed lightly against the seam of her shirt, grounding herself in something real. "I am saying it is not what it looks like," she answered, steady, careful with every word. "It sounds like protection. It reads like protection. But it is not." A faint shift of movement followed her voice. One of the attorneys reached for the document, flipping pages with controlled urgency, his thumb stopping near the middle as he scanned, then scanned again. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Richard noticed. He always noticed small things. That was how he had built everything in this room. Clause 17. Maya continued, her gaze never leaving the table, never rising. To challenge, but never dropping either. The discretionary pool is not capped. It allows reallocation under internal review. That means the medical reserve can be accessed if the board votes it as necessary for stabilization. The words settled differently this time. They were no longer coming from a girl standing beside a cleaning cart. They were coming from someone who understood exactly what she was saying, That fund, she added softer now, is not just numbers. It covers long-term care. Dependents. It is where the company promised security would not be touched. A silence followed that was no longer confused. It was aware. Richard's fingers stopped moving. The pen lay still beside the contract, untouched. Across the table, the attorney who had been flipping pages looked up, his expression carefully neutral, but something in his eyes gave him away. Not panic. Not yet. But recognition. The kind that came when a detail you had overlooked refused to stay small. Run it again, Richard said quietly, not breaking eye contact with Maya. The attorney hesitated for less than a second, then nodded, pulling the document closer, his voice lower now as he spoke to the associate beside him. Numbers, references, internal language began to move across the table in hushed exchanges. The room no longer belonged entirely to Richard. It belonged to the uncertainty Maya had introduced. She remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence still unexpected but no longer dismissible. Behind her, the janitor's cart stood silent, out of place in a room built for certainty and control. And for the first time since she had spoken, no one moved to escort her out. They were too busy trying to understand whether she was right. The quiet calculations at the table did not stay quiet for long. One of the junior associates leaned closer to the senior attorney, whispering faster now, his finger tracing the exact paragraph Maya had pointed out. Another pulled up a digital copy on his tablet, scrolling, stopping, zooming in as if the words might change if he looked at them closely enough. They did not. Richard Whitmore watched it unfold without interrupting, his expression controlled but no longer detached. There was a shift in the room that could not be reversed, not easily. It was no longer about whether a maintenance worker had spoken out of place. It was about whether she had seen something the rest of them had missed. It is structured as a conditional safeguard, the senior attorney finally said, choosing his words carefully, each one placed with precision. But under certain board interpretations, it could allow reallocation. He did not say the word exposed. He did not need to. Richard's gaze dropped to the contract again, this time not as a formality, but as a question. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the page, holding it in place while his eyes scanned the lines with a focus that felt sharper than before. The room followed his silence. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. The deal that had felt inevitable just minutes ago now hovered in uncertainty, balanced on a detail that should have been buried. Maya remained near the door, her presence unchanged, but the space around her had shifted. She was no longer background. She was a variable. A risk. Or perhaps the opposite of one. Who drafted this section? Richard asked, not looking up. The question landed across the table like a marker, drawing a line no one wanted to step over. A man near the far end adjusted his tie, his posture stiffening just slightly. It was a collaborative draft, he replied, his tone even, but not as confident as before. Reviewed and finalized through standard channels. Richard nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the answer without accepting it. His thumb tapped once against the margin of the page, a quiet, deliberate motion that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Standard, he repeated, almost to himself. Then he looked up. Not at the attorneys. Not at the investors. At Maya. The room followed his gaze without meaning to. She stood still, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, as if she had already said everything she needed to say. There was no urgency in her posture, no attempt to convince. Only certainty. Explain it, Richard said. It was not a request. It was an opening. A test. The kind that separated assumption from understanding. A few heads turned sharply at that, surprise breaking through the controlled atmosphere. Someone shifted in their chair, uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. But no one spoke against it. Maya took a small step forward, just enough to be seen clearly under the overhead lights. The reflection from the glass table reached her now, catching the edge of her badge, casting a faint shimmer across her name. The clause uses internal review as a trigger, she said, her voice calm, measured, fitting into the room as if it had always belonged there. It sounds like a safety net. But it is open-ended. If the board decides the company needs stabilization, they can move funds without an external check. That includes the medical reserve. She paused for half a second, not for effect, but because the weight of the next words mattered. And once it is moved, it does not have to be returned. The silence that followed was different again. Not confusion. Not skepticism. It was recognition spreading slowly, person by person, across the table. The associate who had been reviewing the document stopped typing. The senior attorney leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer scanning, but fixed on a single point. Richard Whitmore did not move. His expression remained controlled, but something behind it had shifted, something quieter and far more serious. The pen beside his hand stayed exactly where it was, untouched, as if even the idea of picking it up now required a decision he was not ready to make. The shift in the room did not explode, it tightened, like something invisible had just been pulled too far and everyone could feel it about to snap. A low murmur began at the far end of the table, subtle at first, then spreading in quiet waves as executives leaned toward one another, voices dropping into hurried, controlled exchanges. It was no longer a single perspective. It was doubt moving through authority, piece by piece. One of the investors straightened in his chair, his fingers pressing flat against the table as he looked toward Richard. "If that interpretation holds," he said carefully, "then we are not just discussing flexibility. We are discussing exposure." The word landed heavier than expected. Not loud, but undeniable. Across the table, the senior attorney exhaled slowly, his hand still resting on the contract as if removing it might confirm something he was not ready to say out loud. It would require board approval. He added, almost defensively, though the confidence behind the statement had thinned. "It is not automatic." Maya's voice came again, not interrupting, but entering the space where hesitation lived. "It does not need to be automatic," she said. "It only needs to be possible." A few heads turned toward her again, but this time there was no dismissal in their expressions. Only calculation. Richard Whitmore did not look at her immediately. His eyes remained on the document, tracing the same paragraph for the third time, slower now, as if each word had shifted meaning since the first read. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something that should not have been overlooked. The room felt smaller now, more confined, as if the walls of glass no longer expanded the space but reflected it back inward. "Run the scenario," Richard said quietly. It was not directed at anyone in particular, but the team responded instantly. Tablets lit up, fingers moved, projections shifted across private screens. Numbers began to move in silence, outcomes recalculated under new assumptions. No one spoke for several seconds. Then one of the analysts froze. It was subtle. A pause in movement, a slight lift of the eyes from the screen, a hesitation that should not have been there. "Sir," he said, his voice lower than before, controlled but edged with something real. "If the fund is reallocated under stabilization, the reserve drops below required coverage thresholds within 6 months." The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy. Another analyst spoke, confirming, adding numbers, reinforcing what had just been said. The outcome did not change. It only became clearer. Richard finally looked up. Not at the analysts. Not at the attorneys. At the far end of the room, where a framed photograph sat on a side credenza, just visible through the reflection on the glass wall. A young girl, smiling, standing beside him in a hospital corridor, her hand wrapped around his finger. The image was small, but in that moment, it was the only thing that seemed sharp. His gaze held there for a fraction longer than it should have, then returned to the table. The pen beside his hand had not moved. Not even slightly. "And the medical fund," Richard said, his voice steady, though quieter now, "is tied to dependent care coverage." It was not a question. It was confirmation. The senior attorney nodded once, slowly. "Yes." No one added anything after that. They did not need to. The implication settled into the room with a weight that could not be redirected. Maya stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but her eyes carried something deeper now. Not triumph. Not relief. Recognition. She had seen this before, not in a boardroom, not in million-dollar decisions, but in smaller rooms where signatures meant everything and understanding came too late. The difference was, this time, it had not happened yet. And for the first time since she had spoken, the room was not deciding whether she belonged there. It was realizing what would have happened if she had not been. The room did not erupt into chaos the way headlines might describe it. It folded inward instead, collapsing into a silence so dense it felt almost physical, pressing against every surface, every breath, every thought that tried to move through it. No one reached for their phones. No one spoke out of turn. Even the quiet hum of the building seemed distant now, as if the world outside the glass walls had stepped back to let this moment settle on its own terms. Richard Whitmore remained still, his hand resting near the pen but not touching it, his eyes no longer scanning numbers or clauses, but fixed somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond the document in front of him. The reflection of the city skyline stretched across the glass behind him, long lines of steel and light bending softly in the late afternoon sun, but he did not look at it. His focus stayed anchored to the weight of what had almost happened. Across the table, the legal team had stopped recalculating. The numbers were already clear. Repeating them would not change their meaning. One of the analysts slowly lowered his tablet, the screen dimming as it tilted out of view, as if even the data itself had nothing more to add. A chair shifted slightly, the sound soft but sharp in the stillness, and then faded again into nothing. Maya Carter stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her presence now filled more of the room than anyone had expected. Not because she moved, but because everything else had. The distance that once separated her from the table had closed without a single step forward. She could feel it, not as pressure, but as awareness, the kind that came when people stopped seeing a role and started seeing a person. The overhead lights cast a steady glow across the polished surface, reflecting the contract, the untouched pen, the subtle tremor that had passed through a decision and never fully left. Richard's fingers finally moved, not toward the pen, but toward the edge of the paper, sliding it back an inch, then another, until the signature line disappeared from view. It was a small motion, almost insignificant, but in a room built on decisions, it was everything. No one reacted outwardly. They did not need to. The shift had already been made. He leaned back slightly, his shoulders lowering just enough to release the tension that had held them in place, and for a brief moment, his gaze drifted again, not to the contract, not to the people around him, but to that same reflection on the glass wall, where the faint image of the photograph still lingered in the background. A father and a daughter. A promise that had almost been signed away in language too precise to notice. He exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured, but carrying something that had not been there before. Not doubt. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that did not arrive loudly, but stayed once it did. Around him, the boardroom remained silent, but it was no longer waiting. It was absorbing, recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that had shifted in a matter of seconds. Maya did not speak again. She did not need to. Her words had already moved through the room, through the contract, through the decision itself, leaving behind something quieter but far more lasting. And in that stillness, with the pen untouched and the signature line out of reach, the only sound that remained was the soft, steady rhythm of a choice not made. The realization did not arrive as a single moment, it unfolded piece by piece, across the faces around the table, in the way shoulders lowered, in the way eyes no longer searched for counterarguments, but for confirmation of what they already knew. One of the senior partners leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of him, not speaking, not interrupting, simply absorbing the weight of a decision that had almost crossed a line it could not return from. The legal team no longer flipped pages. The document lay still, open to the same clause that had shifted everything, its language unchanged, but no longer hidden. Richard Whitmore's gaze moved slowly from the contract to the people around him, reading the room the way he always had, but this time the signals were different. There was no certainty left to command, only truth to accept. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look directly at Maya Carter again, and for the first time since she had spoken, there was no barrier in that look, no distance created by title or position. Only a question that had already begun to answer itself. "You said you have seen this before," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying something more human now, something unguarded beneath the control. The room did not react, but it listened. Maya did not hesitate. She did not look down or away. "Not here," she said, her tone calm, her words simple, but grounded in something deeper than theory. "But I have seen what happens when people trust what they are told without reading what is written." The sentence settled into the space between them, not as an accusation, but as a truth that did not need to be softened. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just her words, but the path that had led her to stand in that doorway in the first place. He turned back to the table, his posture shifting again, not in authority, but in decision. "We are not signing this," he said. There was no hesitation in it now. No room for negotiation. Just clarity. A few heads nodded immediately. Others followed a second later, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition that the moment for doubt had passed. The deal, once inevitable, was now impossible. Richard reached forward and closed the folder with a soft, controlled motion, the sound of paper meeting paper echoing lightly in the quiet room. It was not loud, but it carried finality. He rested his hand on top of it for a brief second, then removed it, as if even that contact had weight. Across the table, one of the attorneys exhaled, a breath he had been holding longer than he realized, his shoulders lowering as the tension released in a way that felt both relieving and sobering at the same time. The investors exchanged brief looks, not questioning the decision, but recalibrating their expectations of what came next. The room was no longer focused on what they had almost gained. It was focused on what they had just avoided losing. Richard stood slowly, not as a signal of authority, but as a shift in presence. The movement drew every eye, but he did not address the room. Not immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, his attention returning to the doorway, to the girl who had not been invited into this space but had changed it more than anyone inside it. For a brief moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, the imbalance that had existed between them just minutes ago no longer felt the same. It had not disappeared, but it had been altered, reshaped by something neither of them had planned. "Stay," he said finally, not as an order, but as a request that carried weight because it did not need to be forced. Maya did not move right away. The janitor's cart remained behind her, quiet, unchanged, a reminder of where she had come from and where she was expected to return. But the room in front of her was no longer the same room she had stepped into. And for the first time since she had spoken, the door behind her did not feel like an exit. It felt like a line that had already been crossed. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because of what it carried. Stay. It did not sound like authority. It sounded like something else entirely, something closer to acknowledgement than command. No one in the room questioned it. No one moved to resume the meeting or redirect the conversation. The deal was already gone. What remained was quieter, but far more significant. Maya Carter stood still for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the doorframe, the cool metal grounding her in something familiar. Behind her, the hallway stretched long and ordinary, lined with polished floors and muted lights, the path she had walked countless times without ever being seen. In front of her, the boardroom held its breath, not out of tension anymore, but out of awareness. She stepped forward slowly, not with hesitation, but with care, as if crossing into a space that had just changed its meaning. The janitor's cart remained behind, silent and untouched, a boundary she did not need to carry with her anymore. Richard Whitmore watched her approach, his posture no longer rigid, his presence still strong, but no longer distant. There was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable. He did not sit back down. Instead, he remained standing, meeting her at a level that had not existed minutes before. The room adjusted around them, not shifting physically, but in attention, in focus, in the quiet understanding that what was happening now was no longer part of the agenda. "How long did it take you to see it?" he asked, his voice steady, but softer than before, the edge of authority replaced by something more precise. Maya paused a few feet from the table, the light from above catching the edge of her badge again, her name clear against the reflection. "Not long," she said honestly. "It was written to be overlooked, not to be hidden." A faint movement passed through the room at that. A few exchanged glances, a silent recognition of how easily something like that could slip through even the most experienced hands. Richard nodded once, slowly, absorbing the answer without defense. "And you read contracts like this often?" The question carried no mockery now, only curiosity shaped by respect. Maya shook her head slightly. "No, sir. I just read what I can find." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. Richard exhaled quietly, a breath that seemed to release something he had been holding longer than he realized. He turned slightly, glancing toward the legal team, then back to her, as if recalibrating not just the situation, but the people within it. "You understood the implications," he said, more to himself than to her, but loud enough for the room to hear. "Before any of us did." No one corrected him. No one argued. The truth had already settled too deeply to be moved. He stepped around the table, closing the distance by a few measured steps, not in a rush, not in a gesture of power, but in something closer to intention. When he stopped, he was no longer separated from her by glass or position or expectation. Just space. "You protected something important today," he said, his tone steady, but carrying a weight that had shifted from authority to gratitude. Maya's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, not with pride, but with recognition. "I just said what I saw," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried the quiet strength that had brought her into the room in the first place. Richard held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just real. Around them, the boardroom remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of control or tension. It was the silence that followed understanding, the kind that did not need to be filled. And in that stillness, something shifted again, not in power, but in perspective, as the space that had once been closed began, quietly, to open. The room did not return to what it had been, it simply settled into something quieter, something more honest, as the late afternoon light shifted across the glass walls and stretched longer shadows across the polished floor. No one rushed to speak. No one reached to reopen the folder that now sat closed at the center of the table, its edges catching a thin line of sunlight that made it look almost untouched, almost harmless, as if it had not carried the weight it once did. Richard Whitmore remained where he stood for a moment longer, his shoulders no longer held tight by urgency, his breathing slower now, measured in a way that did not come from control but from release. The skyline behind him glowed faintly in reflection, softened by the glass, the movement of distant traffic reduced to quiet flickers of light that never reached the room. He lowered his gaze slightly, not to the contract, but to his own hands, resting loosely at his sides, as if noticing them for the first time without purpose attached. Across the table, the executives had begun to sit back, not returning to discussion, but simply existing in the aftermath of a decision that had already been made. Tablets dimmed. Screens went dark. The quiet hum of the building returned, subtle, steady, like a reminder that everything outside this room had continued without pause. Maya Carter stood near the edge of the table, not at its center, not at its head, but present in a way that did not require position. The light reached her now from a different angle, softer, warmer, catching the edge of her badge and fading gently across her sleeve. She did not look toward the door behind her, and she did not step forward again. She simply remained, her posture relaxed, her presence no longer questioned, no longer explained. Richard's eyes lifted once more, not sharply, not searching, but slowly, until they met the space where she stood. There was no need for words. The distance between them had already been crossed in ways that could not be reversed. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, the kind that did not announce itself but stayed once it was seen. Then he turned slightly, not away from her, but toward the window, toward the reflection that had held his attention before, where the faint outline of that photograph still lingered in the glass, a father and a daughter captured in a moment that had almost been altered by something as simple as a signature. His hand moved once, lightly, adjusting the position of the closed folder so that it no longer sat directly in front of him, but off to the side, out of the path of anything that might follow. It was a small gesture, quiet, but final. Around the room, chairs shifted softly as people stood, not in a rush, not in disorder, but in a slow, unspoken agreement that the moment had reached its end. No one clapped. No one commented. The silence held, not empty, but full, carrying something that did not need to be said aloud. Maya turned at last, not abruptly, but with the same calm she had carried into the room, her steps light against the floor as she moved back toward the doorway. The hallway beyond waited, unchanged, familiar, but the space she left behind was not the same. The door remained open as she passed through it, the light from inside spilling gently into the corridor, then narrowing as she continued forward, her figure moving farther into the quiet distance. Inside the boardroom, the reflection on the glass shifted once more as the sun dipped lower, and for a brief moment, the room held both what had been and what had almost been, before settling into stillness again, where the only thing left was the quiet, steady presence of a choice not made.